This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we just cannot thank you enough. This episode is co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and I'm delighted to be joined again by Professor David N. Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is a distinguished professor of Jewish history, as well as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Hello again, David. Good to have you.
Great to be with you, Gilad.
And our guest today is a professor emeritus of psychology at Tel Aviv University. He's a world-renowned expert on social and political psychology, also formerly the president of the International Society of Political Psychology. He has written and edited numerous books, most recently Sinking into the Honey Trap, the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was published this year by Westphalia Press. Professor Daniel Bartal, hello.
Hello. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So your analysis, really the crux of the analysis, is the assertion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an intractable one. So what is an intractable conflict? How is it different from other conflicts that aren't so? And why does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict meet the criteria so well?
Okay, it's an archetype really of intractable conflicts. There are several of them. And the characteristics are following. They last, I will start over 25 years. So we have ahead Northern Irish conflicts that took place in Northern Ireland, and it was 500 years. And in Chechnya, it's 300 years. So ours qualifies very well, which is over 100 years. And it's violent, and it's a zero-sum game, which means that people feel, the participant feels that every compromise is really not improper. And, those are mainly the characteristic of intractable conflict. And we have at the moment, in Turkey, with Kurds, and we have in Cyprus that is not really violent, but still lasts in Rwanda, in Sri Lanka, and Chechnya, So there are few of them.
But so are there any conflicts that are not intractable?
Yes, of course. Conflict's dimension, it can be very modest one, like we have from time to time conflict at the moment we have with United States. But often we try to put it down, to play it as yesterday Prime Minister Netanyahu said that we are in very, very good relation with United States, and we really honor the friendship. So, but there is a conflict, because conflict is when two sides want the same goal, and one of them can get, and not two of them. So we have a conflict, and the conflicts are of different size and last differently over different commodities and symbols. And so there are different type of conflict. Conflicts, I would summarize it, is part of human life.
So, Danny, you've published a new book called Sinking into the Honey Trap, which is really a summation of your many decades of scholarship on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you've identified in the book what you call the social psychological repertoire of Israeli Jews. In fact, the book is really a kind of psychological profile of Israeli Jews. And I want to ask you just a very basic question, which is, what do you think psychology, you're a political psychologist, you adopt in this book what you call a socio-political psychological method. What does it have to contribute to our understanding?
Okay, people decide on conflict. So conflicts really begin in the heads of the people, and they have to end in the heads of the people. So it's psychology. In other words, social attitude, values, perceptions, and all cases is the same. So it is repertoire, socio-psychological repertoire that determines the course, the foundation, the intensity of the conflict. People decide. It depends on the decision of people. So it's by nature psychological.
So are these elements of the socio-psychological repertoire a matter of volition? Are they constructs of the wider environment in which people take form? Are they a function of nature, nurture, volition? How does a socio-psychological repertoire come into being? And then maybe you can tell us what it looks like in the Israeli case.
Okay, so they are universal. So it's my contribution to the field by suggesting that every society in intractable conflict develops a repertoire that I call it ethos of conflict, and eventually it becomes a pillar of culture of conflict. So what does it mean really? Every society has to justify the conflict in order that people will mobilize. Without mobilization of participants, of society members, there is no conflict. So the first condition, very important, it has to have a rationale, good rationale, based on religion, based on history, and every conflict has own rationale. Then it is security problem because there is threat, and how do we cope with the threat is also very important element in intractable conflict. Then there is dehumanization, or I call it delegitimization of the rival. Always, in every conflict, there is delegitimization. You have to kill, and you are killed. So you have to explain. The explanation is delegitimization, which means you are pushing the rival beyond the human creature, which means you deny humanity from the rival. And, just giving an example, in Rwanda, Tutsi in the genocide that took place in 90s were called cockroaches. Cockroaches, cockroaches, Jews in the genocide were really compared to rats to some extent. So in our case, Palestinians are, all of them, very generalized terrorists. The terrorists you kill, you fight against, and this is the logic. At the same time, you glorify your own group. So, as we say, Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, and you have patriotism, you have unity, and even you have a lasting peace, which means we strive for peace, but the rivals, don't want peace. They are not partners for peace. So there are 8 themes that together they form ethos of conflict.
It seems like this ethos of conflict is almost a psychological comfort zone for the Israelis. It's something that they feel most comfortable in and would like to get out of. So how do you explain that some intractable conflicts are resolved at the end and others are not, especially why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hasn't been resolved? And you do write in the book, I don't know if it's a separate question or not, about especially 2 turning points the Israeli-Egyptian accord in 1979 that took us on a more positive, upward trajectory, and the second Intifada that took us back down. So maybe by analyzing those two turning points, we can talk about opting out and opting back in.
Right. So, as I explain what is intractable conflict, and by term intractable, it means that it's very difficult to resolve, and there are many barriers to resolve it. And very few of them are still resolved with combination of different factors. So we cannot learn from one conflict about the general pattern, how it can be solved, because let's say in South Africa, it was very much dependent on leaders. The same Algerian conflict that was very dependent on the leader, in this case de Gaulle, that ran for presidency in 1958 as French Algeria, but he changed his mind. The conflict in Northern Ireland, which is not resolved, as you know, but there is a kind of ceasefire that is lasting since 1998, but is not resolved, was a really combination of leadership and external really involvement of Mitchell, and push very hard from bottom line. So some of them are resolved. Cyprus, it's another one, is not resolved at the moment, but it's not violent. So we would wish to be in such a stage. Our almost was resolved, as you know, and there were opportunities, at least three, during Rabin era, that was assassinated, during Ehud Barak era, which almost, but, because of the leaders, missed opportunity, and then Olmert that negotiated in with Abu Mazen almost reached really an agreement. It was really lacked very little, but as we know, he ended in prison. That was really the end of the story. And the present leadership is very, very far away from offering any solution. It's really very nationalistic, and racist, and kind of government that really
So it is a question of leadership at the end of the day. I mean, the French had de Gaulle, Black South Africans had Nelson Mandela, and the white South Africans had de Klerk. And it is a question of leadership, or in this case, in our case, the lack thereof. I mean, there wasn't one serious leader, except, each one ended their term on other tragic circumstances. But there wasn't one single leader that could rally the entire people behind him and take us forward.
Absolutely right. But, also there are other factors, as I said, external involvement. And in our case, we had such involvement. Americans obviously were involved in such. And there is a push from bottom up, which means the pressure, as it happened in Northern Ireland, that the civil society was very, very meaningful and very powerful. In our case, the society was very much divided in the 90s, and the second Intifada and the misinformation of Ehud Barak, who said that Palestinians are not partner, he really shifted the balance, and most of the people of the left and center left their attitudes and opinion and values, and the what we call left, which means doves, really minimized, and they are about 15% only.
So I want to jump in at this point, talking about the Second Intifada, which you just mentioned, Donnie, to introduce an element that has been central to your own practice as a psychologist that we have not talked about, which is the presence of trauma in the story. Trauma really on both sides, issuing from these major historical triggers, the Holocaust in one case and the Nakba in the other case. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about what you referred to in the book as the Holocaustization of the conflict. And then I really want you to address the question as a psychologist about whether there's any cure or remedy for the trauma that has issued from the Holocaust in the Israeli case.
Right. It's an important question, and without it, another person cannot understand the conflict. We are traumatized society. The Holocaust, where 6 million Jews, about 6 million Jews perished. And I am really one from such a family. Was a traumatic experience, is traumatic experience and you need what is called healing in order to move over. And certain factors are that we didn't go through healing, and Holocaust is used very often in order to encourage Israeli to participate in conflict. It is presented as something that can happen again, that applies to different groups, like think about our holidays, Hanukkah, so Greeks wanted to really exterminate Jews, and we have Purim and Persians wanted to exterminate, and we have Pesach, Passover, and the Egyptian wanted to exterminate, and then we have the day of Memorial Holocaust, so the Nazi, and then we have Memorial Day with our killed people in the world, and there were about 25,000 Israelis killed in this war. So my daughter asked, Father, what does it mean? We know every generation, come and want to kill us. So as the answer teacher gave, yes, this is really the story, and it's written in Haggadah that we read, that every generation we are destined to be really exterminated, and it is propagated by leaders. Every prime minister used this theme. Every prime minister, including Rabin, including Golda, and obviously Netanyahu is using very often. So it is alive. Holocaust is alive. It can happen anytime. And therefore, Holocaust is a very important factor in the psyche of the Israeli Jews, which feeds the fear, insecurity, and this is very powerful factor.
So are you saying that it's chiefly the manipulation by politicians that keeps alive the trauma? Because when you compare the trauma of the Holocaust to other traumas, you can say that there perhaps has never been in human history as universal recognition of the evil that was done to the Jewish people. Never has a criminal society atoned for its sins like Germany has done. Never has an offending society offered reparations or compensation, all of which would seem to be elements of a remedy to trauma. So my question is, what can provide that cure to trauma? Is it largely about a cessation, an ending of the cynical manipulation for political purposes? Is that really what needs to happen?
Holocaust is real, and you cannot deny, but it is, I would say, that the manipulation add obviously to the trauma and are kept. So it's another factor all the time. But, it's still alive in the history of Jews. I am a son of someone who went through Holocaust. So it's still alive in our families where we talk about it. There are still survivors of Holocaust who are living in Israel, but also in other places. So it's also this factor that is alive. But you are right, that is augmented very much, manipulated very much, and this adds to the feeling of being traumatized as society is traumatized.
If I could just add one small question, it's actually a very large question, which is through your lenses, both as someone whose family was deeply affected and traumatized by the Holocaust, and as a psychologist, how do you see the Nakba and the trauma that issued from it?
Yeah, I just would like to add a little bit to the explanation of the Holocaust, and I will, few seconds let me, because, it's the slogan, never again, right? Like never again, we should have another genocide. And we agree, all of us, we agree. But then the solution, what is the solution that never again? So I, as a survivor, to some extent, say that we have to teach our students, pupils in high school, what does it mean, racism, nationalism, fascism, and that never again, if you understand the foundation of Nazism, then you have to understand all these elements in order to prevent it again. This is one, never again. Never again other, which is used by the Israeli leadership, is that we have to be strong. We have to have very good pilots, and we have to have army.
Never
strong.
again to us.
Never again to us. Yeah. This is particular explanation, really, why genocide happened. And the other one is universal. The universal explanation really lacks, and students do not learn about it. So this is, another. Now, Nakba is a very powerful experience because Palestinians feel that it's going on, which means that Nakba took place in 1948 with the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians, and obviously many were killed, but it's going on till today. So it's and when I talk with Palestinians, this is what they express. So we feel, like the pogroms that are going on, pogroms of settlers who enter to a village and really murder sometimes, and often they make terrible destruction of property and housing, etc. So Nakba is going on, and this is powerful experience for the Palestinians who feel that we did not end in 1948 but go on, and including in Israel, where we really discriminate our Arab citizens very much. So they feel also that it's going on.
Do you think that, looking back on 75 years of Israeli history and 100-something years of Zionism, that this historical trajectory was perhaps unavoidable, even ineluctable, that, all these factors to take into account the entrenching of this intractable conflict, that, all these points along history that we thought that, there might be some sort of way out, were just destined to be wrong and go down that route into the very low ebb where we are now regarding the prospects of coming out of the conflict?
Yeah, you are really touching a very important factor. We came to a land that was populated. Also, it says that there is a country without people and there are people without country, but it's obviously not true. And we came, and from the beginning, almost, there were violent incidents, in spite of the fact that a small minority of the Jews who returned tried to live together with Arabs in one country, which, doesn't work. We see what is going on in India, what is going in Rwanda, what is going on in Hungary, even, so it doesn't work when you have two different nationalities who have different goals. And what is very important to understand that in the case of Jews, starting with Ben-Gurion, he did not want to define the boundary. He wanted that it will be open. As some of you may know, that the dream was that both of the banks, the Western Bank and Eastern Bank, will be will be the state of Israel. So the Eastern Bank is really populated by Jordanian. It's a Jordanian state. So we have only West Bank in the, but we know, that a few prime ministers that I mentioned before were dreaming about peace, and many others that were in even Eshkol, not talking about Ben-Gurion, that in the 37 was talking about that we don't define the boundary and we agree to kind of compromises that are offered, but we really wish to have different boundaries. Openly, he said it. And it was Eshkol, another prime minister, that was during Six-Day War, he decided that the Jordan River will be the boundary, the border of the Israeli state. So, and this is repeated until today. So, and today you see annexation, you see really apartheid in the West Bank. So the wind goes in other direction very, very obviously, very saliently. And it's a question where, I'm jumping to one of the possible questions, to what extent the demonstrators will refer to occupation as one of the factors that is harming democracy in Israel.
Yeah, this is one of the big questions that's being asked in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and in Los Angeles. The weekly protest movement. Does the focus now need to shift from democracy to an emphasis upon occupation? But I want to stay in the current moment. The moment that was created after the last election on November 1st, 2022, when the far-right government came into power, and ask you, how do you see that moment through your lens? Do you see it as, in a certain sense, a radical departure from what was, or as the culmination of a long process of growing extremism?
Okay. Israel, to the surprise to our listeners, was never democratic. Surprise? Yes. But it's a matter of building impression and propaganda, so-called. So the statement Israel is the greatest democracy in the Middle East when you compare to Saudi Arabia, to Sudan, Morocco. So it's not a big compliment, really. And we have to know that Israel, with the establishment, really was autocratic state, because Ben Gurion was really autocrat, and according to all the criteria that we have, equality, for example, was not, where the Arabs were very discriminated in the governing ways that were governed. So Israel was never democracy. But in the 70s, 80s, it somewhat became to be open. And you could see it in the culture, you could see it in academia, you could see it in civil society. But the Arabs, for example, were always discriminated, and there was no freedom. For example, freedom press, which is led by reporters for Without Borders. Israel today is number 86, between 1 and 160, and was 116 and was never in the low number in this. So I, in this book, predicted that occupation will not be able to be kept only in West Bank, and it will slowly enter into the state of Israel. And it did enter, with regard to the freedom of press, freedom of civil society, the inequalities that we have with regard to Arabs, Bedouins, etc. So was never. And I expected, and it's written here, so I have, 10 years I was working on this book, as you mentioned.
You have hard evidence.
Hard evidence that Israel was moving, especially since Netanyahu came to power in 2009, that is moving towards being authoritarian, because states are not, ideally democratic, but they are hybrid. They have elements of authoritarianism and elements of democracy. So we slowly had elements of authoritarianism in the regime as it was. So I expected when he came to power that there will be more elements of authoritarianism. But what happened when he came to power, he wanted to finish with democracy and made a very important and large step in trying to change the regime in Israel. So what I am saying, that Israelis, Jews, accepted the authoritarianism that was in Israel, and would be probably accepting if there will be small steps. Yariv Levin, the Minister of Justice, would offer somewhat kind of what was done in Hungary or in Poland, where slowly, step by step, change the regime. And he wanted to change really at once. The programs that he suggested in January was really dramatic change of the regime. So we did not expect such a change, and we did not expect that there will be such a resistance to such a change. And therefore we have demonstrators.
One person who did predict, it would seem, such a change was your teacher in 1967, Professor Yeshayahu Leibovich.
You're right.
And you recount in your book.
Yes, absolutely
in an
right.
article he wrote, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what impact Leibovich had on you and what he saw that has come to fruition today.
So I finished my service in Army in 1967 November, and from immediately from the service, I went to study psychology. And Leibovich was a teacher of physiological psychology, and which means something that is independent of really what is going on in Israel. Social psychology could be somewhat related, but every lecture, which was, 14 in total, was beginning with 10 minutes talking about what will happen if the occupation will go on. And he predicted that we will need to have a kind of FBI people, every second, and we'll need this to be a big army, and etc., and it will be a disaster, really a disaster for Jewishness, for Jewish identity of the state. So I was his student and listened to his preaching, and
was he a big influence on you in your professional career and in writing this book and other things that you've researched?
So I have to admit that I come from a Dovish family. My parents were members of leftist party, and I was reared up to be kind of open-minded, and his teaching really not influenced me so much because I was already...
It was pushing an open door.
Right. Yeah. Because I was already at this type of view that occupation is terrible.
Already in November 1967.
Right, absolutely.
So, Danny, I wanted to ask you about your vision of what psychology, the field, aims to do, and you in particular. Do you aim to understand the psyche of the people whom you study, or do you seek to change their attitudes and beliefs and psyche?
It's a very good question. I feel personally that I am a very good advisor, can be, to pyromaniacs. The ones that want to escalate and develop conflicts. I know the foundation, I know the elements that need to be put in the play, how to mobilize people. I can really be advisor to Netanyahu, how to really develop a conflict. I feel frustrated with regard to your second part of the question, to be firefighters. It's very difficult to offer suggestions how to end the conflict. And this is a state of the art of political and social psychology. Mostly they talk about contact theory, where people of both sides meet. But it's not possible everywhere. So in the last years, 5 years, decided to be very pragmatic and innovative and creative, and put my money into to be firefighter. So I developed several patterns where I can really say that I am firefighter, but it's also a trial and very difficult to apply to the whole society. So I am playing with being a firefighter, but it's very difficult.
Okay, Professor Daniel Bartal, author of the new book, Sinking into the Honey Trap, The Case of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And many thanks to you, David. And to Itai Shalem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to please ask you to write us a review. of any kind, good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.